Hi, my name is Renford Reese. I'm a professor in the political science department and director of the Colorful Flags program at Cal Poly Pomona. We're here today as a part of the Prison Race series to have a candid discussion with Mr. John Lee, a person who has worked in the California corrections system for over 3 decades. I want to have a discussion with him about the good, the bad, and the ugly regarding this system. He has the credentials and the credibility to talk about ways in which this system should be reformed. John, glad to have you with us.
Good morning. It's good to be here.
So tell me about your background. Where did you grow up?
I was actually born in Texas. I was raised in Texas, and I went to the Air Force Academy for about a year, and I was back in Texas. And I was going to the University of Texas, and my mother thought, just being a bartender, going there, studying to be an engineer was probably not the best thing for me, so she wanted me to come to California. And actually, I came to California to attend Cal Poly because of their engineering program.
Right.
And my brother-in-law had a different agenda. I didn't know it at the time, but my family actually wanted me to work into the penal system. And I was a bartender at Griswold's, a party bartender, going to school, having a wonderful life. And I went out and I took the test, and the rest is history.
So when you say the rest is history, tell me about your first job working in the correction system.
I didn't have a clue what prisons were about, not at all.
What year was it?
This was in 1978. It's been a long time ago, 1978. And like most people, my impression of prison was formed by Hollywood. And I got in and it was a harsh reality check. It was totally different. I was a correctional officer and I worked the housing units.
When you say it was totally different, was it less violent, more violent? Did you have, what were the type of challenges you faced when you came in as a correctional officer?
Luckily, I had some really good supervisors, and their training methods were, I'd say they were a little bit different, but they were quite effective. They took me to see a dead body of someone who had been murdered.
Inside the prison?
Inside the prison. Rigor mortis had actually set in. You could see the blood. And then it was just a harsh reality check of where you are. And then everything that people told you and they taught you, you learned because you needed it for survival.
So what was your mindset? I mean, after seeing this dead body, what was your mindset after this point?
Well, at first, like most, I was 21, I was young, I'd gone in, and my thought pattern was when people went to prison, they were really humble, they were scared, and they did everything that I thought they were called guards, told them to do. And when I got there, it was totally different. It was more violent than what I thought it was. It was, I had no clue that they had drug dealings in there, extortion, rapes, murders.
Right, so when you hear about the violence, you hear about the predators, the sexual predators. So this is not Hollywood, this is all reality?
What you hear does not prepare you for what you actually experience. You haven't lived it until you've lived it.
Right, so tell me about some of the challenges you faced along the way in the system.
Luckily for me, one of the biggest aids for me was I grew up poor. And when you grow up poor and you're in that environment, I think you're better prepared for it because that element you grow up with. And some of my biggest challenges were trying to connect and really trying to fit in, to find out where you were, who you are. And you had to learn different skills and techniques because what you want to do, the whole trick of it, is to get people to do what you want them to do when you're outnumbered.
Right, and you have to use multiple techniques. You can't just use one monolithic model of trying to get someone to do something that you want them to do.
So correct.
So did you embrace a type of humanistic philosophy, or were you tough, or were you?
Not at first. At first, It's a facade, I think, for a lot of people, because you really don't want the inmates to get close to you. And you're dealing with, there's two different, shall we say, mindsets, okay? The inmates, they have a way that they have to learn to do their time. Then you've got the officers that have to really learn how to deal with inmates. And when you're impressionable and you really don't know who you are, you think you know, but you don't know, there's a facade on where you don't want inmates to get close to you, where you want to be perceived as tough, not weak. And it's really dangerous because sometimes you can go over into what the inmate's mindset is. And it takes some years to mature. And throughout the years, you become more, shall we say, humanistic, yes.
And do you think that the inmates respond to this humanistic approach more or better than they respond to this type of hardened approach?
They respond to, let me put it in more prison jargon. They respond more to the person that's real, that's actually real, that's not being somebody, trying to be someone who they aren't. You actually have to be a very real person. You're there to do your job. You're there to treat them with some respect, with some dignity. They respond to that.
So if you give a person respect, they give you back that respect?
The majority of the time, yes.
Right. Okay, now tell me about some of the incidents. I mean, you said you embraced this humanistic approach. Tell me if that worked all the time, and tell me about some of the incidents that really kind of challenge your philosophy.
Well, working with prison gangs, that doesn't necessarily work all the time. But what they do honor and what they do respect is respect. They give you respect if you give them their respect. My whole outlook basically changed in probably about 1989 or 1990 when I was at the women's prison. And as you start to do more and more, shall we say, the longer I was there, I actually started to do time with the inmates. You actually get to know some of the inmates that are actually there for long periods of time, or those that go out and they come back in. And the more you learn about a person, the more you learn, what they respond to, what they actually need. And when you can start to look at a person in a different light for, shall we say, rehabilitation or to reintegration, you start to see that, this is not an animal. They're human, and they have needs. And that's probably the biggest challenge right now. And there's competing forces. I mean, we had, in my opinion, we had a union that was more for, shall we say, job security rather than for rehabilitation. And at one point, rehabilitation was actually, you were considered, or you're weak,
What if you were a correctional officer or a parole administrator and you advocated rehabilitation, you were looked upon as being weak by other correctional officers that didn't have the same philosophy?
There was actually a split between the correctional counselors and the correctional officers. And what the term was, well, they're more into caring treatment. We're into knocking heads.
Right. So you think it was a 50-50 split?
It was just a split in what their philosophies were, what their job titles were, what their job duties were.
No, I mean in terms of the proportions of, you mean the job duties of the counselor?
The counselors,
versus the
social workers.
Okay,
yes.
well how many correctional officers in terms of proportions and percentages do you think were the head knocker types versus those who really had the approach that you had?
It's kind of hard to say because there are different custody levels. And over the years, you found that if you worked in the highest level, the maximum security, or the level 4s, you had a different attitude. You weren't so much of a head knocker. If you had to take care of business, you had to take care of business, but there was a way to do it. And so that the inmates knew that, hey, this is a job, this is business. Okay? And you were more of a mellow person in a maximum security because these inmates definitely they didn't have anything to lose. You mostly found more of that attitude when you got down into like the level 2s or on the minimum yards. And I think a lot of times people understood or felt as though inmates had more to lose, so you could get away with more, perhaps.
Right. Okay, so you worked about 8 years in the men's facilities, and then you worked over 2 decades in the women's facility. Can you tell me what's the difference? What difference did you see between the men's facilities and the women's facilities?
Women are not violent. Well, they're somewhat violent, but they're not as violent. I didn't have to walk around wondering if I was going to get stabbed. At the end of the day, I knew I was going home. There was less violence, a lot less violence.
Okay. So let's talk about, you spent over 20 years in the women's facility. Tell me how did you connect with these females in prison?
Well, understand that was a big adjustment for me. I had come over from basically working a level 2, 3, and a 4-yard, and I'd gone to a women's facility. And at the time, it did not conform to what I thought was the rules. And it was quite different for me. I was not used to a lot of interaction with inmates. That had been basically kind of taboo. They're in blue, you're in green. And at the women's facility, there was a lot of interaction. They actually wanted to talk. Males didn't want to be perceived as getting close to officers. And they actually wanted to talk. They needed to talk. They would talk you to death rather than fight. And it's a totally different environment.
Right. When
you wanted to get a female to do something, you're going to spend some time talking and explaining. Where at the male institutions, it was do it. They're either going to do it or they're not going to do it. And you just consider the consequences. You count up the cost.
Right. So I want to transition and to talk about some of the reform efforts that are taking place right now. There was a council of 3 federal judges that made a decision back in February of 2009 saying that the California correction system is woefully overcrowded, and because of human rights violations, the lack of adequate health care, the lack of adequate care for the mentally ill, that we must release 57,000 inmates in California. So tell me, why do you think the system is, as some people say, dysfunctional, broken?
Well, that's a multifaceted question, because in society, we are the culprits. One is we have this philosophy that, well, we don't want prisons in our backyard. We want every criminal locked up, and we don't want to let them go. We've passed laws like 3 strikes, for instance. It was just woefully wrong. And now people are starting to see the impact and understand that perhaps we probably shouldn't have done that. It's had a tremendous impact on minorities in the Latino and in the black community. And when you put more and more people in prison and you don't increase the staffing levels, you don't increase the opportunities for educational or vocational training, you don't increase the beds. You got a lot of people crammed into basically what was recreational areas like gymnasiums. There used to be double bunks. And now there's bunks with 3 people, like E-beds. And they have a lot of time on their hands. And this is just breeding, a lot of friction. And friction in turn relates into violence. And when you talk about, well, we need to increase staffing or educational or vocational, you're talking about money. And eventually, taxpayers are going to say, whoa, right now their budget is $10.6 billion. That's billion with a B. And this receiver is saying, well, you're not giving them adequate health care. So they want to increase the nurses, the doctors, the care, and he's asking for an additional $8 billion. But this $8 billion, is mainly for mental health. As you're aware, they closed down the mental health hospitals, most of them. And where are these inmates that are, shall we say, have criminal tendencies or criminally insane? Where are they going to go if these hospitals are full? So we saw a lot of that. And you've got a lot of inmates that have some mental health issues, and they're in that same environment. Some are violent, some are manipulated to be violent, and it's very combustible.
So tell me, I mean, we're not talking to right now. I want the audience to know that we're talking to someone who has, again, spent over 3 decades in the correctional system, but not just as a correctional officer, but someone who ended their career 2 years ago as an associate warden. And so you do have the credentials, you do have the credibility to talk about these things in ways that not many people have. So what do you think we should do in terms of reforming the system?
That's really a tough question because you just can't throw money at it. However, in my opinion, we are paroling the wrong people. But the law forces you to parole these people.
When you say we're paroling the wrong people, who are the wrong people?
There are people that you see in the news every day. For instance, you'll see up in Oakland, 4 police officers were shot. And we have no control over this person. He has to be paroled. And then they want to put it back on the correctional system saying, well, the parole officers, they weren't monitoring him close enough. In the news, you see chases, robberies, and they're quick to say, well, this is a parolee, okay? Well, you really don't have any control over those people, okay? And people who are actually rehabilitated, have reformed, a lot of those people can't get out of prison. They can't get out of prison, you know? There's a point where you can do enough time where you change. Time will actually change you.
Okay, so let's segue into the Susan Atkins case, because I think that's a very powerful case that really highlights the kind of problems, the substantive problems that exist in the system. Can you tell me about her case?
Susan Atkins, I think what's hurting her more than anything else is notoriety. Because when you look at those murders that took place, I think in '68, that's over 4 decades ago, okay? Most of the close relatives are deceased. And now what you see is nephews and nieces that are, quote unquote, we're carrying the torch, carrying the fight on, okay? But when you really look at it, we have a saying that says, at the end of the day, what's the bottom line? And it should be, is she a threat to society? And when we look at inmates, paroling them, that should be one of the bases. Are they still a threat? And
so let's step back. I want to summarize the case I know you have people out there that are unfamiliar with the case. Susan Atkins was convicted of murder back in 1968.
Double murder.
Double murder. And she served over 40 years in the California correctional system.
Correct.
Now she's 85 years old. She's an amputee. She is a diabetic.
And terminally
ill. And when she comes to the parole board for hearings, what are the responses to her?
I haven't been there, but I was fortunate enough to sit in on an interview with her, okay? And what the parole board does is they actually look for ways to keep some inmates in prison. Inmates have actually said during the interviews that they've done everything that the board has asked them to do. And the board has gone as far as to say, well, bring us a book report. A book report? Yes, bring us a book report and we'll see you in 3 years. When you have people that commit murder, okay, there's some, they say, oh, they're so heinous, it's so egregious. Well, any murder should be classified as that. But however, now that we put rehabilitation back in the prison name, and most people were under the misconception that was one of prison's missions, was rehabilitation, okay? When actually the purpose of prison was punishment back in the 80s. Now, the big question should be, when has a person paid their debt to society? That's my question. That's actually a question of a lot of us. As we sit, and I'm talking from the women's prison, we've actually lived with these women for over 20 years. And you see the change in them. You see that they've changed. But some actually have no hope of parole. They keep hoping, but the parole board's still looking for ways to keep them off. And it's, well, when do we forgive? We'll probably never forget. Victims never forget. But we don't.
What's the incentive? What's the motivation of the parole board in being so draconian in the way they handle these inmates?
Political pressure. Pressure from society. You know, a lot of times you're governed by what the governor wants. You get a lot of district pressure from representatives. I'll give you a case, for instance, okay, that I often use, and and she knows that I use her name, Betty Broderick, for instance. Famous case down in San Diego. Killed 2 people, okay? But when you really look at the case, okay, Betty only had a problem with Dan. No one else. She could be your neighbor. She could be my neighbor. Has she changed? Sure, she's changed. But notoriety hurts a lot. And as they age, the taxpayers don't see the impact. What society hears is they don't want a politician that's quote unquote soft on crime, not knowing what that really means. Politicians don't want their opponents being able to say, well, that's the person responsible for releasing Susan Atkins. They don't want that, because then they lose their income. But yet and still, as it averages, and you can look on the CDC website, $35,000, $36,000 per inmate. Well, that's not the actual cost of an inmate, that's the average. So when you get an average, that's some costs are cheaper, some costs are higher. When you're looking at someone, for instance, that's 86 years old, on dialysis, or you get an amputee or a double amputee that's served over 25, 30 years. I don't want to take a lot of focus or desensitize and say, well, they only committed a murder, okay? Yes, they killed someone, but they've changed. Society is not willing to forgive them, but yet we're willing to pay $70,000 to $75,000, probably higher, dollars per year for these inmates to keep them locked up. My question is, what gives society the right, or the parole board, the right, or the jurisdiction to change the sentence of the court? The court never sentenced these inmates to death or life without the possibility. But yet, we keep them in there until they die. I did a research project, and I found that inmates they don't want to die in prison, females. They don't want to die in prison. And later I found there's a lot of other research that supports this. But of course, that's their feeling. Society is driving this. If there was a change in the posture by the legislature, by the governor, I think that you'd see a dramatic decrease in the prison budget, probably prison health care. It's a fine line. I'm not saying that you put some law out that's generic that covers everyone, because that's where people fail. It's got to be on a case-by-case basis, but it's got to be fair. It's got to be fair. There's a lot of inmates, male included, that are over the age of 55, been in since they were 18 years old, okay? They got a 7 to life, 10 to life sentence. And they've done 45, 50 years. Their disciplinary record's basically clear. And you're telling me they're still a threat. Okay, they very may well be. But it's hard for me to fathom that you can say that with a straight face if somebody's bedridden, that they're a threat to society. What's the threat? What's the threat if they can barely get around? And the point now is, what I'm seeing is, there's a lot of employers where their employees have been doing all this time. Their kids have grown up. They're willing to take them in, want them there. Right. To babysit, anything, and that would lower our costs dramatically.
Right. Okay. So, John, I really want to thank you for coming in. There are a few people, again, who can connect the dots of the system. Many people agree that the system must be reformed, but there's not the political will. But you have budgetary, fiscal forces right now that are creating some type of movement. And I think you could be at the center of that movement. Again, few people have the credentials and credibility to discuss this issue practically and intellectually like you've discussed it. I've enjoyed sitting and talking with you. I can feel the fire in your motivation to change this woefully inadequate system. And I want to thank you for coming in and having this candid discussion with us today.
That's been a pleasure. Thank you.